In a world where words now weigh more than weapons, the United Nations has become more than a global forum. It's a battlefield of ideologies. And once again, the world held its breath as two giants stood across the table, China and the United States. The room was tense. Cameras rolled. Not a single seat was empty. But what happened at that UNSC session wasn't just diplomacy. It was a reflection of the truth many are too afraid to say out loud. This is not just about foreign policy. This is not just about Ukraine or Taiwan or trade. This is about what kind of world we want to live in. And today, in that room filled with flags and microphones, courage faced comfort, truth challenged control, and conscience battled power. Let's break down the message that matters, the 5 truths you and I must not ignore, no matter where we stand. When China stood up at the United Nations Security Council and directly called out the United States, it wasn't just a diplomatic gesture, it was a defining moment of raw courage. In that room, where every word is weighed, where every expression is calculated, where entire nations watch silently from behind their nameplates, someone dared to speak what others only whisper behind closed doors. The Chinese envoy didn't just deliver a prepared statement, he confronted a global superpower with pointed truth. And in doing so, he reminded the world that strength isn't always about the size of your army or the depth of your pockets. It's about the boldness to speak, especially when it's uncomfortable. This moment was more than politics. It was symbolic, because we live in a time where speaking the truth has become dangerous, where calling out injustice is seen as disloyalty, where standing up means standing alone. But China's voice cut through that fog, not because it was perfect, but because it was fearless. And whether you agree with what was said or not, one thing is undeniable. It takes immense courage to speak against the most powerful nation in the world, especially on a stage like the United Nations. We often assume that power silences truth, but people in high places won't listen to those beneath them. But here's what we forget. Truth has never needed permission. It has never waited for applause. It rises again and again, even when buried, even when banned, even when attacked. What happened in that UNSC chamber is something each of us can learn from. If you want to change the course of your life, your family, your community, your world, you have to be willing to say what others won't. Too many people sit in silence. They see the injustice in their jobs, the toxicity in their relationships, the corruption in their governments, and they shrink. They whisper instead of roar. They hesitate instead of act. But the world doesn't need more passive observers. It needs brave truth-tellers. It needs people who are willing to look power in the eye and say no more. And sometimes that truth will make people uncomfortable. It may make you unpopular. It may cost you relationships, opportunities, even safety, but it will also set you free. Because at the end of the day, silence protects the system. But speech disrupts it. Speech shifts the narrative. Speech plants seeds that bloom into revolutions. So when you speak, do it with conviction. Do it not because you want to win the room, but because you owe it to yourself to live in alignment with your truth. Whether you're at the UN or in a classroom, whether you're at your workplace or sitting at the dinner table, let your voice be the one that refuses to be ignored. Let it be bold, even when it shakes. Because courage isn't the absence of fear. Courage is the decision to rise anyway. One of the most powerful accusations made by China at the United Nations was that the West, especially the United States, leads the world through a system of double standards, that while they speak the language of peace, democracy, and justice, their actions often contradict their words. This statement struck a nerve because beneath all the diplomatic posturing, it revealed a reality many nations silently feel but rarely say aloud, that the rules are not the same for everyone. Some countries are as harshly for the very same actions. Others are quietly allowed to get away with. And when leadership is built on convenience instead of consistency, trust crumbles. You see, the world can no longer be led by those who demand accountability from others, but refuse to hold themselves to the same standard. It's not enough to call out injustice in one country while ignoring it in another, because of economic interests or political alliances. Leadership, true leadership, is not about being popular or powerful. It's about being principled. When the US or any powerful nation applies pressure on smaller countries, enforces sanctions, lectures them on democracy, yet turns a blind eye when its allies commit similar or worse violations, the credibility of that leadership is lost. And this principle applies to our personal lives too. How often do we demand honesty from others, but are not fully honest ourselves? How often do we expect fairness at work, but show favoritism in our relationships? How often do we criticize someone else's failure, but make excuses for our own? Double standards don't just weaken nations, they weaken individuals. They destroy the very foundation of respect and integrity. People notice, children notice, colleagues notice. Even when no one speaks, they see the inconsistencies, and slowly, they stop believing in you. Not because you made a mistake, but because you refuse to own it. That's why the confrontation at the UN wasn't just about politics. It was a mirror. It forced every person, every country watching to ask, am I being consistent? Am I applying the same standard to myself that I expect from others? Because consistency is where respect is born. And without respect, there can be no influence, no matter how loud your voice is or how powerful your position may be. The moment China accused the US of hypocrisy, it wasn't just a diplomatic jab, it was a challenge to every global leader, every institution, every citizen to lead with integrity, to align words with actions, to prove that justice isn't selective, and leadership isn't just about who's on top, it's about who stands tallest when it matters most. If we want a better world, it starts with better choices. And better choices begin with one decision, to live by one standard, not two, always. Some said China went too far. Others believed the United States needed to be called out. But beyond the politics and alliances, one undeniable truth stood tall in that moment at the United Nations. Every voice matters, especially the ones that challenge the status quo, especially the ones that speak when silence feels safer, because real change has never come from the comfortable or the quiet. It has always come from those brave enough to speak, even when they know the room might turn against them. In that chamber, surrounded by flags, cameras, and global scrutiny, China chose to speak up. It wasn't just about defending a national stance. It was about breaking the wall of global silence that so often protects power. And that choice, that courage, carries a deep message for every single one of us. You don't have to be a global superpower to make an impact. You don't have to sit at a UN desk to be heard. The power of your voice is not determined by the title you hold, but by the truth you carry. So many people go through life feeling like their voice doesn't matter, like what they say won't make a difference, like they're too small to challenge the systems around them. But history tells a different story. It tells the story of individuals who spoke up when everyone else stayed quiet. It tells the story of people who stood alone, and by doing so gave others the strength to stand too. Whether it's a student standing up against injustice in their school, a worker calling out corruption in their company, or a parent fighting for the rights of their child, each voice, when used with conviction, becomes a ripple that can turn into a wave. We've been conditioned to believe that shaking voices are weak, that if you don't sound confident, you shouldn't speak. But the truth is, a voice that shakes is often the strongest one in the room, because it speaks despite the fear, despite the pressure, despite the cost. And that's what real bravery looks like. Not the absence of fear, but the decision to speak anyway. In today's world, silence is often mistaken for peace. But silence in the face of wrongdoing is not peace. It's permission. When we stay quiet, we let the wrong voices dominate the room. We let injustice grow in the shadows. But when we speak, even if it's messy, even if it's hard, we create light. We create space for truth. And we give others permission to do the same. So wherever you are, whether you're leading a movement or just finding your voice, remember this: you don't need permission to speak your truth. You just need the courage to believe it matters. Because it does. The world isn't changed by those who sit and wait. It's changed by those who dare to speak, even when their voice shakes. When two of the world's most powerful nations, China and the United States, clash on a global stage like the United Nations, it's easy to view the moment as chaos, a breakdown in diplomacy, or the beginning of something dangerous. But what if we looked at it differently? What if we recognized that within conflict, there is clarity? Because sometimes it's only when tensions boil over that we see what's really beneath the surface. In that heated exchange, what came to light were not just differences in policy, but differences in philosophy, in values, in how each side sees justice, responsibility, and power. Conflict forces truth to the surface. It exposes hidden intentions, buried grievances, and unspoken fears. And in the process, it demands that we choose, not just between sides, but between silence and action, between staying in the comfort of what we know or stepping into the uncomfortable process of growth. That's the gift hidden inside confrontation, clarity. The moment China and the US confronted each other, the masks came off. Diplomatic niceties gave way to raw honesty. Accusations were made, defenses were raised, but at the heart of it, the world saw something real, and realness always demands a response. This is not just about global politics. This is personal too, because the same truth applies in our own lives. We often run from conflict. We fear it, avoid it, bury it deep inside, thinking that's how peace is kept. But real peace isn't the absence of conflict, it's the presence of understanding. And understanding only comes when we're willing to go through the fire, to have the hard conversations, to face the people or the parts of ourselves we'd rather ignore. Your biggest breakthroughs in life will often be born from your biggest confrontations. The moment you face your own fears, the moment you stand up to what's hurting you, the moment you finally tell the truth, even when it costs you comfort. That's where growth lives. That's where strength is forged. So don't be afraid when things get tense. Don't panic when relationships strain or when your convictions bring you into uncomfortable spaces. Instead, lean in. Ask, what is this trying to show me? What is this exposing that I haven't been willing to see? Because once you see clearly, you can choose clearly. And when you choose clearly, you live powerfully. The clash between China and the US wasn't pretty. It wasn't polished, but it was revealing. And in a world full of filters and spin, sometimes raw truth is exactly what we need. Sometimes we need things to get uncomfortable before they can get better. Don't run from that discomfort. Let it show you who you are. Let it shape who you become. Because in the fire of conflict, the strongest steel is forged. And in the tension of truth, real clarity is born. When China looked across the table at the United States during the United Nations Security Council meeting and said, "You should be ashamed," the room fell silent. But the silence didn't mean peace. It meant discomfort. It meant tension. And yet it was in that exact moment that the world was reminded of something most have forgotten. Peace isn't just about avoiding war. It's about building justice. It's about doing what is right, even when it's inconvenient, even when it's uncomfortable, and especially when it's unpopular. Too often we confuse peace with stillness. We assume that as long as there's no visible conflict, everything must be okay. But history tells us otherwise. Some of the world's darkest chapters happened in moments of silence, when people saw wrong and said nothing, when leaders protected their interests instead of people's lives, when institutions chose comfort over accountability. The kind of peace that ignores injustice isn't peace at all. It's silence dressed as safety, and silence, especially in the face of wrongdoing, only delays the inevitable. Justice is the foundation on which real peace stands. Not dominance, not fear, not negotiation for convenience, but justice. That means calling out wrong regardless of who commits it. That means holding yourself accountable just as much as you hold others. That means creating a system where no country, no person, no group is above the truth. When China pointed a finger at the US and accused it of hypocrisy, of fueling conflict while preaching peace, the message wasn't just for America, it was for every nation watching, every leader and every citizen. Peace demands honesty, and honesty demands courage. In your own life, you may not be sitting in a UN chamber, but the principle is the same. Real peace in your relationships, your workplace, your community. It doesn't come from pretending things are fine. It comes from confronting what's broken, not to destroy it, but to heal it. Peace begins when you stop hiding the truth, when you stop protecting lies, when you're brave enough to say this isn't right, and committed enough to make it better. We all want peace. But many of us aren't willing to do what it takes to create it. Because real peace means uncomfortable conversations. It means losing things, sometimes friends, sometimes power, sometimes comfort. But what you gain is far greater: integrity, clarity, justice, and freedom. A kind of freedom that only exists when truth stands in the open. The world doesn't need more silent observers. It needs bold builders of justice. It needs people who aren't afraid to raise their voices when peace becomes performative. You don't create lasting peace by covering cracks with diplomacy. You create it by digging deep, addressing the root, and rebuilding with truth. That's what the world witnessed in that tense UNSC exchange. Not just conflict, but the painful process of truth trying to rise. Peace isn't quiet, it's honest, and only the brave can build it.